when we put together the Islam and Western Civilization Conference a couple of years ago, which was our first conference in the reconstituted AFA after Avi had passed, we knew a lot of the big names and invited them, but somebody said that there's an amazing woman from Austria named Elisabeth SABADITSCH-WOLFF who we must have. Now, Austria is very close to my heart. I spent lots of time there, and I contacted Elisabeth. She had come out. She spoke at that time. She came out again and spoke on free speech. It turns out she was the defendant in a case in Austria, and she will tell you all about this. To me, what's so crucial, it sounds like, Austria, who cares? Little country, seriously, big deal. It's a huge deal. Not only that it's in Austria, every single aspect of this is so important. She didn't set out to be an activist. She didn't set out to be a truth teller. She didn't set out to, maybe a truth teller, but certainly not to be on the front lines of what she's wound up being on the front lines of. Sort of an accidental activist. And it takes a really special kind of person to take that on and not capitulate. I had pondered that perhaps it's because she grew up, to some extent, in the United States, where we have the Constitution, and we still have the protection of the First Amendment. I don't know. But I imagine perhaps that plays a role. In any event, we are so delighted that she was able to come out here to her one and only California appearance, especially after the having her conviction upheld. It's really insane. It really is. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Elisabeth.
I'm so honored. I'm so grateful. I can't believe this crowd, all because of me, a little housewife from Austria. And I'm not kidding, I am a housewife, because once I leave the US this coming Thursday, this Cinderella will turn into a pumpkin again, as she always does when she leaves the United States. Because in Austria, I don't speak. I don't speak publicly, and I try to stay away from speaking privately. So it's always a blessing to be in the United States because of the First Amendment, because of folks like you who come out on a Saturday night when you could be doing 100 different things than listen to an Austrian housewife, the bearer of bad news. Because I've come to realize whenever I go anywhere, it's always because of bad news. So maybe I should just, well, if I don't show up anymore, you know that it's good news. Maybe that will help, hopefully one day, okay? Karen, thank you so much for making this happen. You didn't get a lot of time to do this. No. Because the verdict came on October 25th. And at that time, I was in tragic hours watching my mother pass away. Oh, wow. And I didn't even, she passed away on the October 29th. So I was in the middle of getting ready for, the inevitable. So I didn't really realize what had happened until a few days after my mother had passed. And actually the day my mother had passed, because a wonderful lady that you may all know, Katie Hopkins, showed up in Vienna that night. And I did what my mother told me. You just, you pick up the pieces, you pick up your little crown, and you move on, and you get things done. Even though it was the day my mother died. She would have done the exact same thing. And so I didn't grieve much, but I prepared to come to the United States and fight. Because now's the time. We have this verdict, we need to get moving. Now is the time to do something. So what I'm going to do tonight is, and Karen was kind enough to tell me when it's 45 minutes so I can wrap it up and, give you the chance to ask me questions. I would like to tell you a little bit about how it came about that this little Austrian, well, little, not little, but this unimportant Austrian housewife came into this international arena, I would like to say, because my my quest for freedom of speech has been crowdfunded from all over this wonderful earth. I didn't set out to do this. It wasn't my plan, except for the fact that I have always been outspoken, and I never accepted anything at face value, let's put it that way. Okay? I never accepted a no, and I always said, let's go do something about it. This is, the Austrian DNA is always to say, well, you know, government says it's right, so that's what we have to do. And I always said, I always distrust government. So anyway, without further ado, I will speak without any notes for, you know, the first part where I tell you about my life and why I am here. When it comes to telling you about the case, I will refer and read from a prepared speech, because I am not a lawyer, and this is very complicated for me, may not be complicated for you. And once I'm done with that, I will return and speak freely again. So, you know, I hope you bear with me. So, I was born a diplomat's brat in Geneva, Switzerland. So my father is a retired diplomat, and I grew up in Switzerland, and then my father was moved to the Austrian Consulate General in New York City in 1975. So my first language was English. I lost my English afterwards completely. In 1977, my father, my mother, my sister and I moved to Iran, to Tehran. You all know what happened in 78, right? Uh-huh. So I was very privileged as a 6-year-old, 7-year-old, first grader, second grader, to live in Iran, a pre-revolutionary Iran. I experienced, you know, some of the Western-oriented Shah times, no covered women in the streets, Austrian beer being brewed. You know, it was a fairly free life. Don't get me wrong, the Shah had his Savak, secret police. He was certainly no saint, we all know that. But life, society, was fairly free. But I also remember that all of a sudden, demonstrations broke out. Of course, I as a 7-year-old didn't understand any of it, but I did notice a change in society. I noticed how there were spontaneous demonstrations. My father would be late coming home from the office. I couldn't go to school for a few days because there were so many bodies, dead bodies in front of the school, and the authorities didn't have enough time to remove the bodies. So I did miss a lot of school. And I remember one day in December of 1978, so it's now, what, 40 years? My mother and my sister and I were forced to leave Iran overnight because all the diplomatic dependents were kicked out due to security reasons. So my mother and my father were separated for almost 2 years, except for Christmas and Easter and summer holidays. Must have been a very hard time for them. And I also remember the airport. I still see the airport. It was crowded with thousands and thousands of people trying to escape pre-revolutionary, already revolutionary Iran. And I remember my father being extremely anxious, trying to get his family out of the country. And I remember him vomiting all over himself because he was so nervous, and there were so many people. And to this day, I feel very uncomfortable in huge crowds. I try to stay away from them. I don't go to concerts or anything like that because I just, you know, it doesn't make me feel safe. So fast forward to 1979, the revolution had broken out. We visited, my family and I visited my dad, and I saw the change in society. All of a sudden, no Coke, because Khomeini said Coke reminds people of whiskey. No 7-Up nor Sprite, because Khomeini said Coke, Sprite and 7-Up reminds people of vodka. All these black covered women in the streets, the still spontaneous demonstrations, this time not against the chador, but in favor of Khomeini. I remember the Allahu Akbar screams from the rooftops all night. I remember 1979 when the American hostages were taken, and how my mother would cook during the summer months that we were in Iran, would cook food secretly during the night so my sister and I wouldn't realize that somebody was cooking for the American hostages held at the Iranian Foreign Ministry. My mother did that. And she kept it secret. I never found out until later. My father's office overlooked the American embassy compound, so he was able to watch everything. And all of this made a huge and very lasting impression on me. And it's but one of the many steps that I will tell you about that paved the way for me to be standing here tonight to talk to you. My father was on the last airplane out of the country of Iran on September, I think, 20th or 21st of 1980, before the Iran-Iraq War broke out. So we were finally reunited again. In 1983, my father, at the end of 1983, my father was posted for about 3 or 4 months to the Austrian embassy in Baghdad. So guess where I spent Christmas? I got to see the war from the other side. My sister and my mother and I visited my dad for our Christmas vacation in Baghdad. We went to Christmas Mass in Baghdad. I can tell you it was very safe. Dictatorship has a tendency to be very safe because it is, in fact, totalitarian, and certain groups are protected. And that includes foreigners, and back then even Christians. Yes, Saddam Hussein was a monster, a tyrant, but Christians and Jews, the few that were left, Christians, there were a lot of Christians there, were protected. Look at the situation today, it's very different. Maybe it wasn't so good getting rid of Saddam Hussein. I'll leave it at that. We also visited places like Babylon and Ur, and places that you study about in school. You see how privileged I was? I really do see it as a privilege to see all of these archaeological, historical sites. But I also got to see what it means to live in a dictatorship. I also got to see, I got to experience war. I'm probably one of the few people my age who know what war is like. And all of this, again, is another step in the direction that I am here tonight. So Saddam and Ayatollah Khomeini have made a lasting impression on me. So fast forward to 1984, which would answer the question why my English is fairly decent for an Austrian. Because my father was posted to the Austrian Consulate General in Chicago. And I was fortunate enough, quote unquote, to attend 2 years of grade school and 2 years of high school in Chicago. And what was so special about attending grade school and 8th grade in Chicago was that I had a fantastic social studies teacher. And back then you needed to pass a test on the US Constitution. Some of you may remember that. It's not very common anymore, unfortunately, to pass a test on the United States Constitution. Now, being the rebel that I am back then, I asked myself, why do I as an Austrian have to study the US Constitution? I should be studying my own Constitution. But nobody was really listening to me, so I had to study. I got a 73. It was decent. I probably should have aimed for a 90 or 95, but it doesn't matter. What changed my life in studying the US Constitution was it is a fantastic document. It's probably the best ever written. It is easy to read. An 8th grader can understand it and appreciate it. And the Bill of Rights, the First and Second Amendments especially, that has been instilled in me, and to this day, I believe from the bottom of my heart that it's most important that all of the countries of the free world have a First Amendment. That has to be done. It must be done, especially given what I've experienced in Austria ever since. So I appreciated studying that. The rest of Chicago, let's leave it at that. Too cold, too flat. Yeah, not exactly my city. We returned to Austria in 1987. I graduated in 1989 and then went on to become a ski instructor. Why is that important? Well, you can't ski during the summer. So the first year of my ski instructing, I was asked if I wanted to spend a few months working in the visa section at the Austrian embassy in Kuwait. That means August of 1990.
Not traveling with you.
No, you don't want to, no. Given that Bush 41 just passed, I think you know what happened in August of 1990. I woke up in the morning and woke up in the middle of a war. And black helicopters hovering above Kuwait City. I don't think you'll be surprised to hear that I'm not a big fan of helicopter noise. Maybe the PTSD got to me. I really don't like they make me uncomfortable. The noise makes me uncomfortable. So I did what a good, what do you call it? A good Austrian, a diplomat's daughter who has experience in war does on that morning of August 2nd. I took the car, drove to the nearest grocery store and stocked up on canned food. The Kuwaitis bought the newspaper. So you see the difference. They had no clue. I did. I had some experience. I was stuck at the Austrian embassy for about 23 days, but I won't go into any detail on that experience. If you are interested in hearing what happened to me during those 23 days in Kuwait and Iraq, come up to me, or I'll give Karen the link to an extensive interview I did with Christian Reporter News out of San Angelo, Texas, and then you can watch that. The lady who did the interview was in tears by the time we had finished the interview. So if you're interested in that, let me know, or let Karen know, and she'll get that to you. So with that experience, I did return to Austria. I kind of settled down. I ended up in the Vice Chancellor's office as a secretary from 95 to 97. Why is that important? The Vice Chancellor was also at the same time Foreign Minister, and when I left Kuwait in 1990, I vowed that I would be back on my own terms and leaving the country on my own terms. I did not want somebody like Saddam Hussein to tell me to leave the country. I wanted to do it on my own terms. You see the little freedom fighter inside me? So I returned in 1997. Same job, same bed, same office, same apartment, almost the same car, just a few years younger, and me older, of course. And I would stay in Kuwait for 4 years. Oh, wow. And that was total immersion in Islam for the first time. You live, you breathe Islam 24/7. And I was older. I was about 25 or 26 at the time. And, when you experience your first Ramadan, you think it's very exotic and you think it's different. And we all want exotic and different, don't we? And then you go on to your second Ramadan, and you're a little bit annoyed to be asked or demanded to follow all these rules as a non-Muslim. Now, I don't have a problem with Muslims following Ramadan. I don't care about that, as long as it doesn't concern me. But even back then, I already knew that whatever Muslims do or whatever Islam commands doesn't only pertain to Muslims, but also to non-Muslims. So I was really kind of getting annoyed. So the third Ramadan was already a real pain in the neck. And by the fourth Ramadan, I was heading up to my apartment. I was living in the embassy compound. And I went to my freezer, got out the salami, and went down to the visa section eating a salami sandwich. Why did I do that? Because I had bulletproof windows while tending to the visa applicants. Okay? Ramadan does that to you. Makes you kind of crazy. So, apart from experiencing Ramadan and Islam firsthand, two important events. First, I met my husband, got married to him. No, he's not a Kuwaiti, he's an Austrian. I picked up the last Austrian in Kuwait. He was nice enough to marry me. The second one is a bit more tragic, but leads into why my verdict was upheld on October 25th. My job in the embassy was not only to head the visa section, but also to read the two lousy English language newspapers published every day in Kuwait. And when I say lousy, I mean lousy, real lousy. But one day, I read the newspaper very carefully because it was a very slow day, very boring. You needed to pass the 6 hours, no internet, no email, nothing, you know, no Facebook, how terrible. So I read it very carefully, and there was an article in this newspaper describing Muhammad and his wife, Aisha, who was shockingly 6-year-old when they got married, and then went on to describe how the marriage was consummated at the age of 9. And I remember to this day, when I tell you it's like a film and, you know, rolling in my mind, I got up, ran to the visa section where the interpreter, our interpreter Hussein, had an office, and who had become a very close friend of mine. I said, Hussein, can you believe what I just read in the newspaper? Is it true about Muhammad and the 6-year-old? I mean, that's terrible. I feel for this girl. And I was expecting him to say, no, you know, this is just lies in the newspaper. Fake news, even back then. I was expecting him to say that. Honestly, see how naive I was back then? And it was not to be. His face became really hard. It was terrible looking at him, and I was shocked to hear him say, "Don't you ever, ever talk about this again. Don't discuss it." And I couldn't understand it. I did not know the reason. And maybe God was watching down on me that day because I didn't ask any further questions. It just lingered in the back of my head. And it was good that way, because imagine if I had started asking questions 10 years before I did. I don't think diplomatic immunity would have protected me all that much. They probably would have kicked me out. So for some reason, Elizabeth, who usually doesn't keep her mouth shut, decided to keep her mouth shut and just just leave it. I didn't touch the topic again, or the subject. So 2000, my time was over in Kuwait. Call me a masochist, but I moved on to Libya. Yes, you heard right. Tripoli, Libya. Austrian embassy in Tripoli, Libya, for 1 long year. Terrible, bad mistake I made. Terrible country, great beaches, but no infrastructure, no food, nothing. No shopping, no cultural life, Nothing. Imagine having to do absolutely nothing. It was absolutely nothing. But I was there on 9/11. Yes. Kind of worried that Gaddafi might be behind this because it would make escape a little difficult. And I really didn't want to get caught in any of the trouble again. I'd had enough by that time. But what did happen was, as I was watching TV in the afternoon, because in Libya we were 7 hours ahead, my landlord barged into my apartment without knocking on the door and started screaming, "The Jews did it! The Jews did it!" And I asked him to leave my apartment immediately because I said to him, I know a lot. I don't know anything about this yet, but I know for certain that the Jews did not do this. So he trotted off, never to be seen again. He apparently believed me or not. Who knows? Who cares? And after 9/11, I decided it was time to leave. I think Islam and I don't really get along all that well. So my husband and I moved back to Austria. To make a long story short, I finished my master's degree, had my wonderful daughter, whom I love dearly, and who is the sole reason I am doing this. If it weren't for my daughter, I would be sitting at home, not doing needlepoint because I'm not really into needlepoint, but I would probably read all my Danielle Steele novels. But Danielle Steele will have to wait until the problem with free speech is resolved. So I didn't do anything until I didn't pick up a book about Islam until 2007. But I need to back up. When I was on home leave, all those years, from 97 to 2001, one thing I noticed every single time was how society had changed. The Bosnian War, Austria was kind enough to allow thousands and thousands and thousands of Bosnians, who are for the most part Muslim, to come to Austria, to resettle, to flee the war, to find peace. And you would see every time, or I would see that, every time I was on home leave, which was usually once a year, I would see and witness the change in society. When I took public transportation in Vienna, I would see more and more covered women. And I remember thinking at the time, I don't have a problem with head covers or hijabs or any of that in Muslim countries. That's okay. I'm never going to tell them to take it off. But we are a Judeo-Christian country. We are a Judeo-Christian continent. And even back then, I thought to myself, they don't belong. Or they take off their headscarf and assimilate. I'm not a big fan of integration. I'm a big fan of assimilation because that's how you deal with it. Because no one asked me when I came to the United States, do you speak English? It was expected of me when I entered school in 1983.
Don't worry about it.
That I would speak English, and I did. And my parents financed the English classes in the summer, not the government, like it's happening today in Austria and in Europe alike. So, in 1997, I may have made the mistake of reading an important book about Islam written by an Indian atheist, which changed my life completely because finally all the pieces to the puzzle fell into place. I finally understood about what was going on with Aisha and Muhammad and the reason for the headscarf. I finally understood all the theological aspects, and I was very, very scared. But I also knew that I needed to do something. And interesting enough, somebody from Center for Security Policy at the time, in 2008, found me because I had been giving interviews online to a blog talk radio and invited me to a big conference in Brussels the belly of the beast, the swamp, even back then. And that's where my career skyrocketed. At the same time, and now we're getting to the interesting parts of the story, at the same time, the Austrian Freedom Party had asked me to give seminars on Islam. So now is the time that I turn to my prepared speech and tell you about how I got into this mess. But before that, I need a drink of water. So, as the situation had deteriorated for the last decade or so, the European Union and its member states have cracked down on free speech. The arrival of so many migrants has accelerated the Islamization of Europe, which tends to be very unpopular. An epidemic of violent crime, more rapes, more harassment of women, the insistence that school must serve halal foods, the permission for male students to refrain from shaking a female teacher's hand, the bullying witnessed in more and more schools in Austria by Muslim boys upon all the girls to wear the hijab. These are all things that citizens dislike. But from the point of view of EU leaders, there's no going back. The migration must proceed. It's a necessary part of the plan, and if you ask what the plan is, a very good book to read on this is Bat Yours, Eurabia. That will explain the plan to you. I don't have time to go into this now, but it is basically population replacement. Therefore, people must not be allowed to discuss these things, nor may they urge the leaders to make changes. Instead, the criticism of Islam and Islamization must be forbidden. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the United Nations call it defamation of religion, and it has now been criminalized all across Europe. For all practical purposes, the EU is enforcing Sharia law on its indigenous residents. 10 years ago, when I first began this work, the number of political prosecutions for hate speech in Europe was very small. The cases could be counted on the fingers of one hand, but that number has been increasing steadily ever since. And it is now rising exponentially. There are now hundreds, perhaps thousands of cases every year in which people are prosecuted for racism, incitement, and discrimination simply for criticizing Islam or mass immigration. And the Global Compact for Migration, which is due to be signed this month in Marrakesh, Morocco, is also going to add to this problem. Thank God President Trump knew that this compact was a problem and refused to sign it, and I'm happy to say Austria has also will also not sign it. Germany will. I wonder why. Unfortunately, many of those prosecuted are being convicted and fined. And horribly enough, some are being sent to prison. A very recent case from last week is a woman who criticized mass immigration into Sweden, and has now been jailed for 3 months. Facebook, just a Facebook post. There are many, many cases of people being prosecuted for speaking the truth about Islam. Far too many for me to tell you about them all. I'll discuss my own case in a few minutes, but first I'd like to say a few words about a friend of mine who is being persecuted by the state. His name is Stephen Yaxley Lennon, but he is better known as Tommie Robinson. He was one of the founders of the English Defence League and was its leader for 5 years. Tommie has been brought to court by the British government numerous times. All of those prosecutions, the hate speech charges and all the others, were trumped-up affairs carried out for political purposes. Tommie's most recent conviction was for reporting on the street outside Leeds Crown Court about the defendants in a grooming trial. Grooming, you see, is a euphemism for the sexual slavery of native British girls by Muslim gangs. End quote. The media and the government do their best to obfuscate what is going on in major British cities. In the space of just 5 hours, Tommie was arraigned, 5 hours, okay? Tommie was arraigned, tried by a judge, convicted, and sentenced to 13 months in prison. He spent a brief period in a safe prison, that is, one without too many Muslim inmates, but was inexplicably moved to a prison with a large Muslim population. In order to avoid being attacked and possibly killed by Muslim inmates, he had to remain in solitary confinement. The kitchen staff who prepared the prison's food were Muslims, so in order to avoid being poisoned, Tommie had to survive on meager supplies of canned tuna and fruit that could be sent in from outside. We are all fortunate that the dedicated efforts of his legal team were able to achieve his release after 2 months. If he had spent all 13 months under these conditions, he probably would not have survived. As it is, he left the prison looking like an emaciated ghost of his former self. He has recovered well in the 4.5 months since then, but he acknowledges that the PTSD induced by his ordeal is still afflicting him. Tommie will be going to trial yet again next spring. News about him spreads through the alternative media because the mainstream media uniformly demonize him as a racist thug and a neo-Nazi. He needs a top-notch legal team to do battle with the highest level of the British judicial system. So his defense is being crowdfunded by donations from all over the world, similar to mine. The real issue behind all these arrests is that Tommie speaks the truth about the danger to the British people posed by Islam. But he is no longer being prosecuted for hate speech offenses. The state doesn't want the substance of what he says to be aired in an open courtroom and discussed in the national media. Therefore, other types of infractions must be found and other charges brought. The current case against him is simply the latest example of the repressive tactics being employed by the totalitarian British state. So here's the plan. Lock up the most charismatic leader the British counter-jihad has. Put him in with his most dangerous enemies, Muslim criminals who have promised to kill him. Make sure that the guards are absent or looking the other way when the trouble starts. Then, as far as the Sharia-compliant British state is concerned, the problem has been solved. The UK, like other enlightened governments of Western Europe, has abolished the death penalty. But there's more than one way to kill a political nuisance. You don't have to march him up the steps to the gibbet, put the noose around his neck, and open the trapdoor under him. Ladies and gentlemen, what is happening to Tommie Robinson is capital punishment by alternative means. And now, for my own case. In early 2008, I began a series of seminars in Vienna under the auspices of the Austrian Freedom Party, explaining to members and other interested parties what Islam, the Quran, and the Hadith, the sayings of Muhammad, really teach, along with basic tenets of Islamic law. In my presentations, I discussed the consequences for democracy, freedom, and human rights. For the next 1.5 years, the interest in my seminars grew and attendance increased, though I never had a crowd like yours before, by the way. The success of my lectures drew the attention of Austrian leftists, and who are determined to discredit and destroy the work of those who criticize the tenets of Islamic doctrine. To them, we are racists, fascists, and Islamophobes. And unbeknownst to me, the left-wing magazine News sent a reporter to one of my seminars to make a surreptitious recording of it. As a result, in November of 2009, a criminal complaint was filed against me for hate speech. From an Austrian left-wing point of view, my offense was compounded by the fact that my seminars were held under the auspices of the Freedom Party. Despite its popularity with Austrian voters, the Freedom Party was back then reviled as a xenophobic party by leftist media and politicians. The Austrian Freedom Party, by the way, is now a part of the Austrian government, a coalition partner, the junior coalition partner. So it's come a long way in those 10 years. The complaint against me was not filed by the state, but rather by News Magazine, the publication whose reporter had infiltrated the seminar. For the next 10 months, the possibility of a formal charge was left hanging over my head, but I received no official word about what might happen to me. All I could do was retain legal counsel and wait. In April of 2010, I gave a deposition to the Office for the Protection of the Constitution and Prevention of Terrorism. After that, there was nothing from the prosecutor's office. Finally, in September, I learned that a formal charge would be filed against me. A few days later, I received official notice from the court about my trial date, November 23, 2010. During the trial, the issue of pedophilia came up. In light of Muhammad's status as the perfect example for Muslims, as stated in Quran 33:21. I explained what the Hadith collections are and that they constitute an indispensable part of Islamic scripture. I emphasized that I had made up none of what I said, but simply quoted canonical Islamic scripture concerning Muhammad's conduct, including his marriage to a little girl named Aisha. The trial was then adjourned until the following January. At the second hearing, excerpts from the seminar recordings were played back, demonstrating that the original charge of incitement to hatred or hate speech was totally unjustified. The judge then discussed my statement that the conduct of Muhammad is exemplary for Muslims and took particular issue with the statement. And I'm going to quote this verbatim, and I would like to tell you that I'm constantly being misquoted in the media. The media says that I said Muhammad was a pedophile. False. I never said that. I said, what would you call this behavior today if not pedophilia? I was very much aware that you could not call, under Austrian law, you couldn't call Muhammad a pedophile. But I was looking for another word. Aware of the fact that I can't call him a pedophile, I was looking for a synonym. That's all I did. I did not seek to denigrate or vilify anything or anyone. So the pedophilia, the sentence, what would this behavior be called if not pedophilia, which was a reference to the Prophet's marriage to a 6-year-old. Evidently aware that the charge of incitement to hatred was never going to fly, the judge, at her own discretion, eventually announced a new charge. Denigration of religious beliefs of a legally recognized religion in Austria. Paragraph 188 of the Austrian Criminal Code. My defense was unprepared for this and requested the trial be adjourned. When the court reconvened in February, events swiftly moved to a close. The judge decided that the language in my seminars did not incite hatred, surprise, surprise, but the utterances regarding Muhammad and pedophilia were punishable. In particular, the judge found that the use of pedophilia was factually incorrect. Listen to this carefully. It was factually incorrect as this is a sexual preference solely or mainly directed towards children. The judge stated that this cannot apply to Muhammad, who was still married to Aisha when she attained the age of 18. Let that sink in. Thus, I was found not guilty on the count of incitement to hatred, but guilty on the charge of denigration of religious beliefs of a legally recognized religion, to be punished with a 480 euro fine, approximately $500 US, or 60 days in prison. The charge in which I was convicted was ludicrous on the face of it. Not only did I never say that Muhammad's actions constituted pedophilia, but Muhammad's actions, which were undisputed by the court, included having sex with a 9-year-old. If I had said what I was accused of, It would have been nothing more than the simple truth and unremarkable to any normal, sane person. Would you agree?
Yeah.
Probably.
Yes, definitely.
So, I appealed my conviction to a higher court. In December of 2011, the verdict was upheld. Later, the case was considered by the Austrian Supreme Court, which upheld the verdict in 2013, in December of 2013. It's crazy, isn't it? It gets worse. Believe me, it gets worse. Thus exhausting my options for justice in Austria, I appealed my case before the European Court of Human Rights. On October 25th of this year, the court ruled against me. And I will pause now and give you a little more information about what this wondrous court stands for, because you've probably never heard of the European Court of Human Rights. It's a forgettable court, as you can imagine, okay? But you still need to know what it is, because it is the court that upheld my conviction. So the ECHR, European Court on Human Rights, is the highest court in the area of the Council of Europe. Do not confuse this with the European Union. The European Union itself has its own court, the European Court of Justice. Has nothing to do with the ECHR. The ECHR was established in 1959. It includes 57 member states, and the jurisdiction reaches all the way into wonderful human rights upholding countries like Azerbaijan. A justice from Azerbaijan was on the panel that convicted me, that upheld my verdict. I'm sure you're very surprised. What is important to know is that the ECHR was established by the European Convention of Human Rights. Some would argue that it is somewhat similar to the Bill of Rights, this European Convention. I disagree. Because the European Convention on Human Rights grants rights. The Bill of Rights doesn't grant rights, as far as I can remember. The ECHR weighs court decisions in individual nation states like Austria against the European Convention of Human Rights. And what is important to know about this European Convention are the two articles that were weighed against each other in my verdict. And I know legal minds will cringe at my use of words. Please bear with me, I'm not a legal mind. So there's Article 10, freedom of expression, which places many restrictions on this very freedom of expression. And the European Convention says freedom of expression carries with it duties and responsibilities. Sounds sinister, doesn't it? And each state can decide which duties and responsibilities. It is an effect. I consider myself a fundamentalist on freedom of speech, and I'm proud of it. And I do not like... Yeah, you can clap. I mean, thank you. I'm very fundamentalist. Why? Because I don't believe in freedom of speech, but. I believe in freedom of speech, period. Only with those restrictions placed on it by the Supreme Court, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's only 3, 4, the Brandenburg and, some other...
Defamation, fighting words.
Exactly.
Lying lying to law enforcement, lying in the court.
That's all fine with me. Those are the restrictions I can live with. Anything else, no. Because that's no longer freedom of speech. That's a freedom of speech, but. Let me quote you a very sinister part of the ruling. And if you feel like reading the entire disaster that is called a ruling, I will forward the link to Karen. And if you're interested in reading it, it is in English language. You can ask Karen and she will forward the link to you. So I'm quoting right now. The court found that the domestic courts, i.e. the Austrian courts, carefully balanced the right to freedom of expression, and now listen carefully, with the rights of others to have their feelings protected. It gets worse. Just wait. I haven't finished yet. It gets worse. And to have religious peace preserved in Austrian society. Okay? Beautiful, isn't it? So what they're saying is freedom of expression is not absolute, but should be balanced against one against the rights of others to have their religious feelings protected. Notice, we're not talking about freedom of religion here. We're talking about feelings. And two, to have religious peace preserved in Austria. Shocking. First question, who are the others? Second, the court doesn't mention who the others are, but it's implicit, of course. How is others defined? And isn't every critique of every religion or anything at all, as a matter of fact, hurtful to someone's feelings? To which I say, get over it. Live with it. Okay? There is no such right. There exists no right to be protected from hurtful speech. For someone's feelings, I'm sorry. Speech, yes. Feelings, no. The second part, I think, is even creepier. The freedom of expression, according to the court, has to be balanced against the right to have religious peace preserved in Austria. So what the court is actually saying is critique of others may thus lead to a breakdown of the fragile peace witnessed in many European cities. That is what this actually says. And for me personally, the most important sentence to describe all of this madness is the following. The ECHR judgment defends those who threaten violence, but not those who engage in debate. That's, to me, this is not from the ruling, but it's a commentator wrote this sentence. And I think this is very true. I did not go out and tell everybody in the street to go kill some Muslims, because that's not what I do. That's not my job. And it's also not in my DNA to do any of that. I wouldn't want that. I want the debate. Let's discuss it. Let's talk to each other in a civil manner. You have your arguments, I have my arguments, and let's weigh those arguments. Let's talk about it. So, what else do I want to tell you? Yes, the ruling confuses the protection of rights and feelings. We are now in a feeling-based legal situation, no more the right. We're no longer talking about rights. Once hurt feelings become a matter of law, religious rights themselves become precarious. Another problem with the ruling was the ECHR complained that my seminars were not objective. Yeah. Why do I have to be objective? I didn't know that if I was telling you about my life or my opinions that I needed to be objective. The court believed that I should have been objective. Who cares that I didn't meet the standards of an objective quote from the ruling. The court had wanted me to meet the standards of an objective contribution to a public debate.
Nonsense.
Absolute nonsense, yes. One important matter. You're going to ask yourself, why does this concern us here in the United States? I'll give you two examples, two reasons. First of all, Resolution 1618 of the United Nations Human Rights Council. It happens to be part of the case law cited in my ruling. This resolution was adopted unanimously by the United Nations Human Rights Council in 2012. This resolution targets speech, especially criticism of Islam. You will not be surprised to hear that the resolution was sponsored by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. And it urges states to take, and I quote, to take effective measures to address and combat incidences of religious hatred. And 1618 is thus a call to curtail certain kinds of expressive acts. Again, you might be wondering, what do the United Nations concern us? President Trump, wants us out, is reducing the money. Well, the problem is that back then in 2012, Resolution 1618 was applauded by Secretary of State Clinton, and she said, we need to overcome the divide, the false divide that pits, listen carefully, religious sensitivities against freedom of expression. Sound familiar? Yes. So we're talking not about freedom of religion, but religious sensitivities. A very slippery slope. So now, freedom of expression and freedom of religion are pitted against each other. Hillary Clinton back then wanted to advance 1618 by countering offensive speech. How did she want to do that? And you may remember this famous quote by Hillary Clinton. She said, not by using more speech or discussion, but by using old-fashioned techniques of peer pressure and shaming. Maybe some of you remember that. To which I say the American people do not need government to tell them what to abhor or find offensive. Not surprisingly, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation is a staunch supporter of freedom of expression. But according to them, freedom of expression does not entail insulting others, denigrating others, and mocking others. Okay. Another reason why you need to be aware of what is going on in Europe. House Resolution 569. Condemning violence, bigotry, and hateful rhetoric against Muslims in the United States. It was introduced in the House in December of 2015. It has now been, it's now lingering, slumbering, sleeping somewhere in committee. But you can be sure that it will be reawakened as soon as the right people are in power again. So watch out. The First Amendment already protects all citizens and non-citizens alike. Thank God for that, because it also protects me. And the question remains, are Muslims in the United States in need of greater protection? Is there a House resolution condemning violence, bigotry, and hateful rhetoric against Christians or Jews? Probably not. So why do we need one against Muslims? Just something to think about. I also want to tell you before I finish up with my prepared statements, what happened in Minnesota just a few days ago. The hotline, did you guys read about that hotline? A hotline has been installed by Muslims asking people to report those non-Muslims who speak against Islam. Minnesota. Snitching. Now you know why I'm here. Now you know why you need to be very careful, why you need to listen, and why you need to watch what happens in Europe. The ECHR's decision has repercussions that extend far beyond Austria. The same reasoning about preserving religious peace may be applied to any country that falls under the court's jurisdiction. And since Islam is the only religion that is ever likely to violate the peace when it is insulted, the court has effectively imposed Islamic laws against blasphemy throughout Europe. In other words, it has instituted Sharia. That is why I've decided to appeal the decision to the Grand Chamber of the European Court of Human Rights. There is no further avenue of appeal. Dear friends, this is my last shot. And that is also one of the reasons why I'm here tonight, because I do have to pay my brilliant lawyer, and I'm here to seek your support in that, but also your support in keeping my back. Just, stand by me. As soon as I'm done with my speech, Michael is going to go around and distribute some business cards. And if you find it in your heart to support me, I would very much appreciate it. It's a 501(c)(3) tax deductible setup that we did through the Center for Security Policy. And any money that I do not need from my own lawyer for whatever reason goes to support those in Europe who need my help. Not Tommie Robinson, because he has his own, but there's countless others. There's one I have in mind, especially a German who is being constantly harassed right now and has absolutely no means of paying his lawyer's fees. So, you know, help us. We need your help, both of us. You may be asking yourselves, well, I already got to that. Why is this important to you in America? Resolution 1618, House Resolution 569. Ladies and gentlemen, Europe's present is America's future. What you're witnessing in Europe is either already here or making its way across the pond. I urge you to exercise your fundamental constitutional rights while you still can. Speak up and speak out against what is happening at every opportunity. Thank God for your First Amendment. Thanks to the Bill of Rights, prosecuting dissenters is much more difficult. Not impossible, but much more difficult here in the United States. And thank God for the Second Amendment. Most Europeans have no ready access to legal firearms. So when the refugees assault them, so-called refugees, invade their homes and rape their women and children, they cannot defend themselves. The only thing they can do is call the police, and you know all about that. So I implore you, as American citizens and patriots, hang on to your hard-won rights. The Constitution is being taken away from you bit by bit. Take action while you still can. You are so fortunate to live here in the United States, but large forces are indeed arrayed against you. Your enemies, many of whom are right here in America, make no bones about what they intend. They want to eradicate American exceptionalism and make the U.S., just like Europe, a subjugated state. Even President Trump is no guarantee that your freedoms will remain. The march through the institutions has been very successful, and the same is true, in case you're wondering, of the new Austrian government. The personnel may have changed, but the left is still very strong. People, especially young people, have been and are still being brainwashed by the media, by the educational system, and by non-governmental organizations. This is so true, and so very true, on both sides of the Atlantic. As for myself, you're probably not going to be very surprised if I tell you that I will continue to speak the truth no matter what. I owe as much to my beloved daughter and her children and her children's children. No matter the final outcome, I want her to be able to say, my mommy did everything she possibly could. Europeans and Americans share a common heritage. We must hang together, or we will surely hang separately. Dear friends, I urge you to stand with me. No surrender, ever, and thank you very much for coming here tonight. I'm a lone fighter. I seriously am. We are an army of two in Austria. And I do hope you take action, both in supporting me, supporting Karen and AFA. We both need your support. We couldn't do it without you. She's on the front lines. I am. You don't need to be on the front lines. There are people who are willing to lend faces. You don't have to do that. But you've got to support those who do. That's what I would like to give you on your way home. You know, we're willing to do the work, giving the cause a face, right? Absolutely. Right, Karen?
Right.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for having me.